Speaker. I want to use this opportunity, Mr Acting Speaker, to talk about some very serious concerns I have about the direction of mental health policy in Australia. My basic contention is that personalities and rhetoric and charisma are driving the direction of mental health rather than science and evidence. Last year, in May of last year, 2011, the Gillard government announced it would spend $2.2 billion over 5 years on mental health initiatives. And the biggest program that announced expenditure on was $222.4 million, which was to be matched by state governments for the rollout of 16 EPPIC sites nationally, which will have the capacity to assist more than 11,000 Australians with or at risk of developing psychotic mental illness. A month later, amid growing criticisms of the ability to help those at risk of becoming psychotic, Patrick McGorry, who's the chief architect of the EPPIC services, told the Australian that EPPICs do not treat people with psychosis risk, but only patients who have their first psychotic episode, so in direct contravention to what was said in the May 2011 announcement. So you can see the confusion. The initial announcement was that they would be for the purpose of assessing those at ultra-high risk of developing psychosis. Then there was a back down by both McGorry, the architect of EPPICs, and the mental health minister. And then we had the state government indicating that, in fact, that was one of the chief functions, was to assess those with... Now, how could the functions of the most expensive program that's being rolled out nationally be so confused? And I've got to say it's for two reasons. It's because we've been let down by the politicians in Canberra of all sides. I'm one of the rare critics in politics of what's happening. And we've been let down by the media. They've been inattentive to the detail of what's on offer. And in fact, the problem is they've let a handful of gurus, relying on rhetoric, relying on charisma, and relying on hype, drive the direction of mental health policy in Australia. And they have accepted their overblown claims without scrutiny. And the danger is that young Australians are going to suffer as a result. Now, Patrick McGorry is undoubtedly the biggest guru, the biggest of those gurus, and EPPIC is very much his baby. And Patrick McGorry has two claims to fame. First is obviously the fact that in 2010 he was made Australian of the Year. The second is that he's the world's most prominent advocate of preventative psychiatry, certainly one of the world's most prominent advocates. Now, the philosophy of preventative psychiatry its theoretical basis has an appeal in common sense. It's basically the idea that a stitch in time saves 9. In other words, if you get in preemptively, you get in before people become mentally ill, you can help them, you can prevent it. He uses the language of early intervention when really he's not talking about early intervention. He's not talking about getting people when they become psychotic. He's talking about getting in there prior to the advent of psychosis. The theory is that you can spot and stop psychosis and a range of mental illnesses before it happens. As I said, intuitively it seems like a reasonable theory. However, the evidence, the independent evidence that's available shows there are two problems with the theories. Firstly, you can't predict with any accuracy who's going to go on and become mentally ill. In the case of psychosis, the predictions of accuracy are somewhere between 36% and 8%. And secondly, the second problem is that even when you do predict those that are going to go on and become psychotic, the interventions that are on offer simply don't help in the long term. There's no evidence of sustained benefits. Now, the problem that we're all saddled with is that Patrick McGorry has been unable to accept that his theory doesn't stand up to the evidence, and he's been unable to accept that even when this theory has been rejected internationally, that we really should be doing a double take on what we're doing in Australia. Now, we can thank Professor McGorry for actually putting mental health on the agenda, the political agenda in 2010 in the lead up to the 2010 election, because his status as an Australian allowed him to do that. But we can't continue to blindly follow him where he tells us to go. But frankly, that's just what's happening. The rhetoric continued after the election. In March 2011, Professor McGorry was the co-author of a blueprint for mental health that significantly said this: EPPIC has the largest international evidence base of any mental health model of care, demonstrating not only their clinical effectiveness but also their return on financial and social return on investment. This is a mature model simply requiring implementation in Australia. But frankly, the hype is not backed up by the evidence. In 2011, the Cochrane collaboration, which is acknowledged internationally as one of the world's most rigorous systematic and comprehensive sources of independent, reliable medical information, found that there was inconclusive evidence that early intervention could prevent psychosis and that there is a question of whether the gains are maintained. Professor McGorry responded by attacking the Cochrane review, saying it used flawed methodology. Now, as I pointed out, Cochrane is probably regarded as the gold standard for international research. Now, the debate started to change for Professor McGorry when, in fact, science started to catch up with some of his claims, when the international debate about the inclusion of attenuated psychosis syndrome in DSM-5, the next version of the Bible of Psychiatry produced by the American Psychiatric Association, happened last year. In May 2010, he was quoted in the Psychiatry Update in an article called DSM-5 Risk Syndrome, a Good Start, Should Go Further, as saying the proposal for a DSM-5 to include a risk syndrome reflecting an increased likelihood of mental illness is welcome but does not go far enough. Later, when pushed about the issue, McGorry, the great enthusiast, who had become McGorry the indifferent, then went on to become McGorry the denier, denying his previous position. On the ABC World Today program on the 12th of May 2011, I had said that McGorry was a leading international proponent of psychosis risk syndrome as a new psychiatric disorder for inclusion in the next edition of DSM-5. Professor McGorry responded by saying, contrary to Mr Whiteley's statements, I haven't been pushing for it to be included in the DSM-5. Now, that's not been my position, but it's a new area of work. It's only been studied for the last 15 years. So if we take those three positions, the great enthusiast, the indifferent to the denier, and recap, in 2010 he's describing the proposal to put attenuated psychosis syndrome in the DSM-5 as innovative and timely, has not come out of left field, and is based upon a series of conceptual and empirical foundations built over the past 15 years. The heat goes on, and in 2011 the response becomes, I haven't been pushing for it to be included in DSM-5. That hasn't been my position. It's only been studied for the last 15 years, so you know we haven't got all the answers. Now, it's important to understand why psychosis risk why the idea of a psychosis risk disorder, attenuated psychosis syndrome, was removed from the DSM-5. It was removed basically for three reasons. The first reason being that the rate of false positives, somewhere between 64% and 92% false positive rates, was one of the reasons. The second was the idea that labelling someone as being pre-psychotic would necessarily be stigmatising, could be stigmatising, and would in some ways be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the third concern was the inappropriate use of antipsychotics in people that have never been psychotic and are unlikely to go on and become psychotic. Now, as I said, when Patrick McGorry seemingly abandoned its inclusion in DSM-5, that was a high point of the trust that had developed between myself and Professor McGorry. But I've got to say that I now distrust him for two very clear reasons. One, he's actually has acknowledged that it's a problem when other people do it, but not a problem when he diagnoses it. But what really turned me around was when I got access to a training DVD that's produced by Patrick McGorry's Origin Youth Health. This DVD actually trains people on how to diagnose attenuated psychosis syndrome. This is still for sale, even though it's been removed from the DSM-5, and even though Professor McGorry said he doesn't support its inclusion. Now, I encourage people to actually go to my blog and have a look at an excerpt from that thing, and have a look at and see if what you think you find passes the... there's a video blog there, and you can actually look at an excerpt from the training DVD and see if it passes the common sense test. According to Professor John Giordini, somebody who I have great respect for, the Professor of Psychiatry at Adelaide University, he says that he looked at the DVD, the training DVD, and he said, in fact, it's a great training tool because it demonstrates how not to carry out a psychiatric interview and interact with young people. A damning comment. Now, the recognition of attenuated psychosis syndrome is a very controversial issue, but more controversial than that has been the role of the use of antipsychotics in the treatment of people who are not psychotic, who are considered to be at risk of becoming psychotic. After the pressure went on around the debate around DSM-5 and the inclusion of attenuated psychosis syndrome, Professor McGorry began to adjust his position. In December 2010, he wrote that antipsychotic medications should not be considered unless there is a clear-cut, sustained progression to a frank psychotic disorder meeting full DSM-4 criteria. The only exception to the previous statement is where there has been a definite failure to respond in the first and second line treatments. Now, all of that actually kept me happy at the time. That was in late 2010 in response to some concerns I'd raised with him. That kept me happy at the time, thinking that he'd realised that the research shows that antipsychotics are not a good way of treating people perceived to be at risk of becoming psychotic. But it seems he never actually gave up on his treasured theory. This is after he said, well, we've got all this evidence that says let's not use it. He continued to actually do this trial. Look, I contend if you can't prove it in 15 years of trialling, if you can't prove it in 15 years of trialling antipsychotics on people that are not psychotic and are never likely to become psychotic, why do you continue to do it? Now, we've got to go back to this claim that Professor McGorry used in the lead up to the 2010 election, where he said that EPPIC has the largest international evidence base of any mental health model of care. If that were true, we'd have a mature model. If that were true, we could accept there wouldn't have had to be these backdowns. So I also think that we need to be concerned about some of the frankly disease mongering that comes out of the mouth of Professor McGorry and his allies. I was at a conference down in June in Perth, an excellent conference hosted by the Richmond Fellowship, where Professor McGorry cited a study, and I think it was a New Zealand study from memory, where he claimed that between the ages of 18 and 25, 51% of people will have a psychiatric disorder. I mean, this is disease mongering. This is actually turning normality into disease. And it denies people who are ill and do need treatment, it denies them resources because we're spreading them too thin. Now, what's so upsetting is not just that these statements are being made, but the media are not questioning them. They're letting them go straight through to the keeper as if they're absolute truth. One of his great debating tricks is to describe people like myself and those who work in the field, people like John Giardini and others, as being proponents of late intervention. Well, we're not. We're actually arguing for early intervention. When people become psychotic or become mentally ill, get in there and aggressively intervene, help them. It's completely disingenuous to paint his opponents as being proponents of late intervention. Am I alone? It's a relevant question. I mean, I'm a non-expert, I'm a politician. I'm probably the only politician who's actually stood up and said we need to be concerned about this major investment in mental health in Australia. But I tell you what, I may be alone in politics, but I'm not alone in psychiatry. In fact, there are a whole range of very prominent psychiatrists who are very critical of where we're going. One of the most revealing things was that the Psychiatry Update in October 2011 had a survey of psychiatrists in Australia, and it revealed that almost 60% of psychiatrists think the federal government's focus on EPPIC is inappropriate. Others that have had plenty to say are Professor Alan Francis, the architect or the chief author of this book here, DSM-4, the current edition of the Bible of Psychiatry, who has been a fierce critic of Professor McGorry. In fact, he says he's very charitable in what he thinks about McGorry's intentions. He says, McGorry's intentions are clearly noble, but so are Don Quixote's. The kindly knight's delusional good intentions are misguided intervention, and misguided interventions wreak havoc and confusion at every turn. And goes on to say that Australia is really in danger of following him blindly down an unknown path that is fraught with dangers. Others that have been critical are Professor George Patton, who told The Age that the Origin antidepressant prescribing audit revealed just how much we needed to look at the evidence base of these conclusions. David Castle, very high-profile psychiatrist from Melbourne, who was very critical of it. And even Professor Vaughan Carr from the University of New South Wales, who wrote an opinion piece that was very dismissive of Professor McGorry's claims that this was the most cost-effective treatment, describing his claims as a utopian fantasy based on published evidence that is not credible. Look, the message I want to put out there, and I've run out of time, the message I want to put out there is that we need to go back to evidence. I've actually met Patrick McGorry. I like Patrick McGorry. I think he's a very charismatic individual, and I think he's well-intentioned, but that's not the point. The point is we cannot have mental health policy driven by Rhetoric, it needs to be driven by evidence.